Welcome to Soulivity.com's passion-driven interviews with founder Brian Wesley Johnson. Each of these carefully curated interviews is all about supporting you and getting inspired to live your best life today. So let's get started. Here's Brian.
Listen, I want to begin this with a little bit of honesty around tonight's show. As I was thinking about the opener for this show, I was finding myself kind of struggling. You see, tonight's show is all about God. You know, the human understanding of God. No pressure, Brian. You know, for a long time and by a lot of different people, the who and the what of this deity has been argued and debated. I mean, there's been wars fought over just trying to answer this question. So to begin our show with a jazzy intro was, to say the least, difficult. But then I thought about this again from a different perspective, and I had the idea that maybe this is really about power, and power in a certain way. I mean, regardless of what you call it, God, spirit, infinite intelligence, universal intelligence, this being has always been thought of as a pinnacle of power. Yet for many of us, what we've been taught is that this power is separate and apart from us. But how can this be when at the same time God is supposed to be everything, everywhere, at all times? Though I've come to my own conclusions around this show is about helping you answer that question for yourself. And tonight we have a very special guest who can help navigate these complex waters and hopefully give you some needed knowledge, awareness, and wisdom. His name is Reza Aslan, and he's a noted scholar who's devoted his life to the pursuit of understanding the religions of the world. He has a very celebrated book and renowned book called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a New York Times bestseller, and it's been translated into different languages all over the world. And his latest book, God, A Human History, is the story of a complicated history about how we have created a humanistic version of the divine, which a lot of times lives outside of our reality. And he's going to go into more about this during the interview today. It's deep, y'all, very deep, and it's a worthwhile read to gain a different perspective on how over the centuries we as humans have created and recreated this all-powerful, all-knowing being throughout the ages. So with that, I want to welcome to Soulivity Live, Mr. Reza Aslan. Hey, Reza, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I'm doing really well. Thanks. It's great to talk to you. Sorry again about the technical difficulties.
No, hey, things happen. This is what it's all about. And so we just move with the punches. And I know that your time is kind of limited, so we're just going to jump right in, okay?
All right.
In the book, specifically in the beginning of the book, there was a statement that really caught my attention. And it reads, throughout the history of religions, there has been one symbol of God from which practically every other symbol and metaphor in nearly all of the world's religions have derived. Us, the human being. What is the humanized God? And why is it important for us to understand this concept?
The humanized God is the phrase that I use to talk about this almost universal impulse that all human beings have, regardless of their culture, regardless of whether they believe in God or not, and really throughout all time, to project onto God, to conceive of God in human terms, to project onto God human emotions, human motivations, human personalities, human desires, even a human body, as a means of making sense of God. And as I say in the book, it's an unconscious impulse. It's an impulse that we are barely aware of. And it's an impulse that we barely have any choice over. It's kind of embedded in our brains. It goes back deep, deep into our human evolution.
Wow. What inspired you? I mean, this is a pretty deep and rich subject. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. What inspired you at this moment or these moments to take this additional leap, which we all need to hear, of course, and read and understand? But what was it at this time that kind of moved you into this particular book?
In some ways, this book is kind of the culmination of the work that I've done up to this point. What I normally write about and talk about is religion, religious history, religious figures, the interplay of religion and politics, or religion and violence in the world. This is the first book that I've ever written that's about faith, that's about the religious impulse, not about religion itself. And I'm a person of faith, and I'm also a scholar of religions, and people sort of always ask me how I reconcile the two. How is it that I can, study the religions of the world in a dispassionate and historical way, and yet still believe in God? And my answer to that question was always, well, it depends what you mean by God.
Right.
And this word, it's just, what's always been so funny to me is how this word God, which of all the words in the entirety of the English language, is probably the most variable word there is, and yet it's also the word that we never bother to define. We just all assume that we mean the same thing when we say God. Do you believe in God? Yes or no?
Right.
And my answer was always, well, first let's try to figure out what we're talking about when we say the word God. And what I discovered as I was doing the research for this book is that more often than not, whether we're aware of it or not, and again, whether we are believers or not, what the vast majority of us think about when we think about God is basically a divine version of ourselves. Right. A superhuman being with human emotions, human attributes, but without human limitations.
Now, you begin the book basically from maybe the first, how can I say this, pseudo-modern version of God and how we relate to God, and that's the story of Adam and Eve, right? I mean, most people know.
Yeah, I do. I do a little fun little thing where, I basically play with the Adam and Eve trope, the myth of Adam and Eve. That, okay, if we're going to say that Adam and Eve were the first human beings, well, let's say they're the first. Okay, let's do that. Let's say, what would they actually have looked like if they were the first Homo sapiens?
Right.
How would they have hunted? How would they have lived? And what would they have believed?
Right.
And so, I construct this narrative about these two characters, Adam and Eve, sort of like the first Homo sapiens, basically. And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Look, what stood out most about that story and that point in terms of like the importance of that story for this complex, experience and understanding?
Yeah.
What was that? What were some of the things that kind of stood out for you?
Well, so more than anything, honestly, it was just a tool to help people understand primitive spirituality. Because, when you're talking about prehistory,
right,
you're, by definition, you're talking about something that's steeped in mystery. It's very difficult for us to talk about prehistoric times without getting into complex language and scientific explanations. And that's not how I write. That's not how I communicate. And so what I wanted to do was essentially simplify these enormously complex ideas about prehistoric spirituality by creating these two characters, Adam and Eve, and sort of putting you through a quote, a day in the life of them as spiritual beings. But I'm also, I'm playing with something that I've written about a lot and talked about a lot, and that is what exactly myth is. It's unfortunate that in our modern parlance, the word myth has come to mean falsehood. That's not what myth means. That's certainly the connotation of myth, but it's not the denotation of myth. The dictionary definition of myth is a story about a god. And so, when I say that, the Adam and Eve myth, I don't mean to say that it's not true. What I do mean to say is don't confuse fact with truth. Those are two different things in the ancient mind. And so, this is kind of it's taking the truth of the Adam and Eve myth and putting it into the facts of what we know about, ancient spirituality.
Right. I mean, you have done, especially in the first.
So did I lose you?
Yeah, the first couple of chapters were very detailed, but very important to discuss, like, those specific pieces.
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So you move from the story of Adam and Eve into later talking about things like idols and the Messianian period. Share with us a little bit about the importance and why that was also another important part of this story that you're weaving.
Well, so, if you understand this humanizing impulse as being, born of the brain, that it's just this kind of unconscious thing that we do, we use ourselves as the lens to understand the universe. And certainly when we try to understand something as difficult to conceive of as the divine, of course, we use ourselves in order to understand the divine by making the divine more and more human-like. But what happens is that eventually that unconscious impulse becomes conscious, that the implicit nature of that impulse becomes explicit when we develop the technological skill necessary to start fashioning gods, to actually start to carve gods, out of stone, out of wood, out of bone. When we begin to start creating images of the gods. And again, just think about this. So, how else would we do it? I mean, if we're in the process of creating an image of a divine being, what else would we do but give that divine being a head and a torso and legs and arms? And so what that does is it actualizes the impulse, right? It makes it concrete. And so think about it this way, if you're going around and you have this kind of fuzzy, blurry idea of the gods in human form, and then suddenly that thing becomes concrete and real. Now it's an idol. It looks like something. That thing that you carved will forever be God to you.
Right.
The metaphor that I always use, or the analogy that I use is, how sometimes you watch a movie and then you go and read the book that the movie was based on, and the entire time that you're reading the book, all you're doing is seeing the movie in your brain, right? You're seeing the actor be the character the entire time, right?
Right.
That's what happens. So when we achieve the skill necessary to start actually creating images of the gods, that unconscious impulse becomes real, it becomes concrete, it becomes, and I don't mean this as a pun, set in stone all of a sudden.
Right.
And by the way, the exact same thing happens when we develop writing. Now we begin to write about the gods. We begin to place them in narratives, in stories. We put them in a situation, say at the beginning of the world, or in the midst of debating some aspect of the universe. And now that they're in story form, again, what choice do we have but to give them our emotions and motivations, to have them act the way we would act
Right.
in a particular situation.
Right.
And so that unconscious, implicit impulse to humanize the gods becomes conscious and explicit.
Is this also why, and I'm linking this to the writing, is this also the reason why, in terms of like power and control, during certain periods, why the written parts about God and these kinds of things were kept from the masses, and that no, to get this information, you must go through this, come to me for it, because I own this story, I own how this is written, I own who and what God is supposed to be.
Well, yes, but actually it starts earlier than that. You can't really have what we would nowadays recognize as religion. In other words, within a temple or an institution or, a priesthood and everything that comes with it, until after we stop wandering and we begin to settle down. See, we used to take our gods with us as we went from place to place to place.
Right.
And then eventually, what we did was we began to settle down, and the gods were suddenly no longer movable gods, right? And again, that humanizing impulse starts to kick in. We need homes, so the gods need a home, so we build them a temple. We need food, so the gods need food, so we give them sacrifices.
Gotcha.
We need clothes, so the gods need clothes. We literally start clothing the idols. We put clothes on them. The ancient Mesopotamians would put makeup on their gods, would change their clothes. By the way, that's still a very routine process in most Hindu temples, where the priests will go in and will literally, change the clothes of the gods. If it's cold, it'll put a jacket on them, etc. We'll put perfume on them. That impulse started when we first started to settle down. But here's the thing. Now that you've got a temple, you need someone to take care of that temple.
Right.
Now that the God lives inside that temple, you need someone to take care of that God.
Right.
And now suddenly the idea of a priesthood starts to arise. And with priesthood comes access. With access comes power and hierarchies and patriarchies, and everything that we now know, about religion starts at that point.
Oh, okay. I got you now. I'm with you, Reza. I'm with you. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense, because it's from that initial idea, like you said, it's this construct that's built around this initial idea, and people place themselves at wherever they want to place themselves in the hierarchy based upon their initial connection with it.
Right.
Without giving it away here, more into the latter part of the book, you talk about these definitions of God. God is. And one of them is God is one, God is three, and God is all. What is the basic kind of definition of those specific pieces? I mean, everybody, you're going to have to go read the book to get a lot more. But I'm letting Reza give you a little sneak peek here. Okay.
Yeah, so that the last third of the book is about the rise of monotheism, which is a tricky thing. I mean, it's hard to understand this, but in the hundreds of thousands of years that there has been belief, or what we could call the religious impulse, the idea that there's only one God is barely 2,500 years old. And by the way, that's not to say that it didn't arise every once in a while. It did. Every once in a while, some prophet would stand up and say there's only one God, and usually that prophet was silenced, rejected, and sometimes violently so. Because the human mind just couldn't understand how all of our human attributes could exist in a single God. It just made much more sense to have a God for each one of our attributes, a God of love, a God of war, a God of darkness, a God of light, a good God, an evil God. When someone would say, no, all of those things exist in one God, people just, why would that be the case? That makes no sense at all.
Right.
And so it took a very, very long time for this idea to finally stick. And it did sometime around 586 BC among the Israelites during what's called the Babylonian captivity. And that's that notion that God is one. And it was a revolutionary idea, but it also wasn't all that popular. I mean, almost immediately, sects of Jews began to break off and to reinterpret this idea of monotheism in interesting ways. Most interestingly, try to figure out a way to get acts of evil out of God's hands. Like, that was an important thing. Like, okay, fine, there's one God, but that God can't be both good and evil. That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so all kinds of ideas were created to kind of ameliorate that theological problem. One particular sect of Judaism that we now call Christians came up with a very good idea, which was the devil, a guy that does not exist in the Old Testament. There is no such thing as an evil being who is the adversary of God anywhere in the Old Testament. That idea suddenly arises in the New Testament. And so that's, the Jewish idea was God is one. The Christian notion, Christianity, the most important thing to understand is that despite the fact that Christianity began as a Jewish sect, within a generation, non-Jews, Greeks, outnumbered Jews in Christianity, by 10 to 1. I mean, it spent a very short amount of time as a Jewish religion, and very quickly became a Greek religion. And the Greeks were not monotheistic. They too had this kind of, they were very loose with the idea of monotheism, which is why the idea of the Trinity, God as three, right? That God can come in different forms, including as a human being, which is really the exact opposite of everything that Judaism has ever thought or, preached about God. Every definition of God that Judaism has ever come up with does not allow for the possibility of a man who is God. And so, but for the Greeks, that made perfect sense, right? I mean, Caesar was God, so it's not that big of a deal, right? So it was much easier for the Greeks to accept this idea than it was for the Jews, despite the fact that Jesus himself was a Jew. And then when you get to Islam, what you have is this attempt to kind of revive Jewish monotheism, right? The people who read the Quran, what they notice is that over and over again, the Quran goes out of its way to deny the Trinity, right? Just it's this kind of constant refrain. God is not three, the Quran says. God is one. And in many ways, the Quranic definition of God was a deliberate attempt to bypass Christianity's definition of God, which was all-encompassing at the time, and revive the Jewish idea of God as one. But what happens within Islam is that unadulterated form of monotheism, it comes across a kind of theological conundrum, which is, if there is only one God, and if that God is indivisible, then how can anything exist that's not also God?
Right.
And so what you get in Islam is this notion of Tawheed, which ultimately, the Sufis really grasp onto, which is that God is everything. God is all.
Right.
That there can't be a division between creator and creation. They have to be one and the same. Gotcha. So there you get it. God is one, God is three, God is all.
Perfect. Okay. I got it again. Last question on this subject, and then we're going to turn a little bit. At the end of the book, because I'm trying to give people just a quick glimpse of how this flows. you state that you end the book where it began, the soul. What do you mean by that?
The earliest belief that human beings held, and indeed this is a belief that all the evidence that we have indicates predates Homo sapiens. It's a belief that we can find in Neanderthals. It's a belief that we can find in Homo erectus, is that whatever we are, we have two natures. We have a material nature, the body, and then we have an immaterial nature. And we, in the modern parlance, we would use the word soul. I mean, that's obviously not how they would have thought about it, but you get what I mean. The idea being that there is a part of us that isn't material, that is eternal. We have, and I laid out, in the book, ample evidence of that belief, going back not just to the very beginning of our species, Homo sapiens, but as I say, even in previous species of humans before our species even existed. We are, as a lot of modern psychological studies have shown, born with this belief. It's embedded in our brains. In fact, it's a belief that you have to unlearn, right? It's not a learned belief. It's something that you have to that you have to be taught isn't true.
Right.
And for about 200 years now, anthropologists and sociologists and cognitive scientists and evolutionary theorists have tried to figure out why is it this case? Why is this universal belief in the soul, this ever-present belief that exists in all people throughout all time, in every religion, in every corner of the world, and as I say, even before we existed? Why? And I'm just gonna cut to the chase and tell you we don't know. We have no idea. The best answer that science has been able to come up with is that it's just some accident, some trick of the mind. That's what it is. And listen, that's not a bad theory. It's a theory. Right. It can't be proven, can't be disproven. Right. But it's a theory that it's just a trick of the mind. It's an accident of evolution. I guess what I'm arguing is that an equally good theory is that it's not an accident, that it's deliberate, that it's by design, that this is who we are. Right. That we are meant to believe that there is something beyond the material realm, and that it's embedded in our brains. Again, no way you can prove that either. And so it's all just, it comes down to the individual and what the individual, him or herself, believes. But what cannot be denied is the universal nature of this belief. It's our first belief, and it's our most comprehensive, most universal belief, and it is a belief that we are increasingly recognizing we're born with.
Reza, as you talk about this, and especially about things that are going on in the world, typically Soulivity tries to not shy away, but talk more about the moving into a different realm of a perception, reality, based specifically on what you're talking about right now. But I also want folks to know that we also need to pay attention to other things that are going on so that we can decide what we want to do and decisions that we want to make. And I'm specifically talking about things that are happening in our social political world, both here in the United States and abroad. I know you are very passionate about these types of things like this, especially like some of the violence that's happening in the Middle East around a specific decision that's been made around a city, Jerusalem, and how that is literally started lighting a match around people's centuries old unresolved stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship of the things that you're talking about in your book, how that relates to even just how we embody the soul, how we think about the soul, and and maybe even giving us some advice about some steps that maybe we can take that you would do.
Yeah.
Just kind of going there. Just, I mean,
I hear you.
This just happened yesterday. I know your time is limited, but I just wanted to kind of squeeze this in because this is something that's related to everything that we're talking about. And
sure is.
I can't, in good consciousness, not talk about it. So,
well, look, if we have this compulsion to conceive of God as a divine being who looks and thinks and acts and feels like we do, then what that means is that we create a God who basically becomes a projection of our biases and our bigotries, our virtues and our vices. A God that suddenly has our politics, our social views, right? And so, of course, I mean, that makes perfect sense why then you see religion become such a destructive force in the world. How religion can be used to fuel violence and bigotry, and how religion can be used to manipulate people into voting against their interests. How religion can be used, as it's being used right now in Alabama, to excuse pedophilia and child molestation. And, if you're a good, faithful person, you got to be scratching your head and thinking to yourself, what the hell is going on? How can this possibly be? And the answer is simple. When you create a God that's just a divine reflection of yourself, then you implant in God everything that's good and bad about you. And so we then we construct these religions based on our own strengths and our own weaknesses. And so, there's a lot of ways to get around this. There's ways to, I think, promote peaceful interpretations of religion and for people of faith to make their voices heard and to drown out those who use faith for evil purposes. But in the end, it all comes back to this cognitive impulse that we've been talking about all along. And so I end the book with an appeal. What I'm asking people to do is recognize this unconscious impulse that we have and to do something about it, to stop thinking of God in human terms, to dehumanize God, if you will, and instead think about God the way our ancient ancestors, Adam and Eve, did, frankly, the Homo sapien version of Adam and Eve, as the divine nature of the universe, as the force that underlines all things. If we figure out a way to construct our gods not as some kind of divine personality, but as a divine force, then you recognize that God is much bigger than any one religion. Right. That people of faith have far more in common with each other than their dogmas or their doctrines or their institutions. And I think that really is not just a recipe for a much deeper spirituality, but it's a recipe for a modern spirituality, one that allows someone to have that deep, meaningful experience of the divine in the world without the baggage of these man-made religions.
Right. Wow. Reza, with that, I'm going to I think we can just kind of let it lie right there. Because let
that one soak in a little bit.
Yeah, because that's the affirmation, right? I mean, the affirmation for what we do here at Soulivity, what my own conclusions around spirituality, but I guess the same for you. And so I want our community to kind of like take that in and use it. and buy the book. Buy Reza's book. It's fabulous. I mean, I'm on my second read of the book right now.
Thank you.
And it's worthwhile reading. And Reza, would you come back and join us again? I mean, in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we know how to do this, we can do it a lot easier.
Exactly. Well, Reza, thank you again for joining us tonight on Soulivity. And thank you for your words. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for giving us some of this knowledge that we need so that we can continue in our journeys again, all this relates to passion, all this relates to purpose, all of this relates to a higher quality life. If you don't know who you are and what you're about and where you're going, then you can't get there. So that's what this kind of information with Reza is all about. So thank you again, Reza.
You got it.
Until then, everyone, this is Brian Wesley Johnson saying thank you again for joining us. Wishing you love, passion, and of course, happy living.
We want to thank you for watching Soulivity.com's passion-driven interviews with founder Brian Wesley Johnson. From celebrities to best-selling authors, Soulivity.com is all about inspiring you to live your dreams and create your best life today. We invite you to listen to our other fantastic interviews with new ones available every single week. Please also visit Soulivity.com and start your journey toward your passion, your purpose, and higher quality living. See you next time. This work is subject to copyright owned by Affinity Global LLC. Any reproduction or republication of all or part of this audio is expressly prohibited unless Affinity Global LLC has explicitly granted its prior written consent. All other rights reserved.